This is Rogers TV.
Focused on quality and convenience, there isn't much you won't find at Marie's Mini Mart. Home-style breads, sandwiches, plus a variety of artisan breads and delicious single-serve desserts available exclusively at our Frecker Drive location. Marie's Mini Mart, with 25 locations wherever you go, there we are.
My guest today was the 5th Premier of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. He went on to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador. He is Clyde Wells, and it is a pleasure to welcome him to the program. Thank you for being here, Clyde.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to go back to the beginning. You began life in central Newfoundland, and afterward your family moved to the west coast of the island. Tell me about where you grew up and a little bit about your family, your siblings, your parents.
Well, my first memories are really of when we lived in Bishop's Falls. My father worked with the railroad, so we moved around a little bit. And I was born in Buckins Junction, and then we moved from there to Bishop's Falls. And when I was 7, we moved to Stephenville Crossing, where my family continued to live and where I left from to go to university. But I grew up as a young boy in Stephenville Crossing from the time I was 7 until I finished school. And then I worked for a couple of years on the Air Force Base, the United States Air Force Base at Stephenville, mostly, although I had a brief period as a plumber's apprentice. And who knows, if I hadn't gotten laid off, I might have been a successful plumber today.
Well, I know as a homeowner, there are times when I wish I had been a plumber's apprentice. Yeah. It might have saved me some money.
Yeah, that's always come in handy.
Yes, that's right. You went to Memorial University. When you went to Memorial, did you have it in mind to become a lawyer?
That was my objective. I have no idea where it came from. All I ever knew is I wanted to be a lawyer. And with 9 kids and my father working with the railroad, there wasn't much chance when I finished high school. But fortunately, I was very young at the time. I was only 15, and I had a chance to work for a couple of years and still start to be a lawyer at an earlier age. My father's circumstances changed a bit because both my older brother and I worked, and we essentially gave him whatever we earned. And when I was about 17, after working for a couple of years, my father got a chance to buy a small grocery store. The owner of it had a heart attack and he needed to sell it. And my father took his pension out and the money my older brother and I had given him. And with that, he bought this grocery business. And I said to him, well, now I can go and be a lawyer. So that's when I went to university.
Now, while you were at Memorial, you joined the Canadian Armed Forces, I believe. What motivated that?
It's no longer the case, but there was a time, because this was so soon after the last war, in the Cold War situation of the time, when Canada and through the Department of Defense wanted to maintain a cadre of trained people, and they had a Canadian officers training program at all the universities. There was a COTC contingent, and you joined that, and you did training one night a week in the local D&D establishment. In that case, it was Buckmaster's Field, and in the summer you did in more intensive training for 3 months. For each of 2 years, you'd get a commission as a second lieutenant at the end of 2 years. It was a means of having a summer job.
Right.
And it was good training, good discipline. And I got into it not because I had any desire to get into the Army or anything, but you may remember the name Mose Morgan.
Oh, yes.
Who
Yeah.
was the political science professor at Memorial at the time. And I remember when I went in to register, Mose saw Sid Noel, who was a,
Right.
and you know that name too, probably. He's a political scientist at the University of Western Ontario.
Wrote a great book on Newfoundland politics.
He did, indeed. And Sid was going to study law.
Yes.
That was his plan. And Mose showed up at the registration area where we were, and he said, you two fellows are going to study law. I better be your faculty advisor. So he switched us from Professor Pitt, David Pitt of the English department, to him. And the next thing we knew, we were both in the COTC without a lot of thought or anything. But it didn't do me any harm. As a matter of fact, it probably helped. Anyway, I did the time, the 2 years, the 2 summers, and got a commission, and then I didn't pursue it further until after my second year of law school. I was struggling to find a job, and I couldn't find a job, and somebody said to me, look, Clyde, you were in the COTC. I said, yes. Well, you should check with the Judge Advocate General's office in Halifax, where I was going to law school. You may be able to work with the JAG office for the summer. So I did, sure enough. I got on and was sent off to Ottawa for the summer. So I had my summer job, and that meant I could get back. I'd be able to get back in my 3rd year of law and finish. And while I was there, they said to me, look, if you're, what do you plan to do when you finish law school? And I said, I have no immediate plans. I go back and practice law or try to get involved in the practice of law. They said, well, would you like to come and work with us for a while? I said, well, I hadn't really thought of it. I said, now, if you would, we'll help you pay for your final year. So that was music to my ears because
Yes.
I still needed more money than I had to get through the year. So I said, okay, and that's what I did. So when I finished law school and was admitted to the bar in Nova Scotia, I then went to the JAG.
So with that experience under your belt, you eventually moved back to Newfoundland and joined a private practice in Corner Brook.
I did. That was in 1964. And I went to work with Kevin Barry, who was
Right.
a well-known lawyer in Corner Brook and a very, very fine man. And it was a good association for me. It was marvelous working with him, and I enjoyed it.
So was your practice general, or did you specialize in certain types of law?
Well, it started out as a general practice, and most lawyers in Newfoundland have a general practice. But then I got more deeply involved in litigation. I started to do a lot of litigation. The more you did of it, it seemed the more you were asked to do, or the more work you got to do. So I ended up doing a lot of litigation, and some very interesting and challenging litigation. Unfortunately, that would take me into St. John's most of the time because there was no sitting Supreme Court judge in Corner Brook at that time.
Right.
There was a district, or what in most provinces is called county court judge, but their jurisdiction was limited. At first it was $1,000, and then it was increased to $2,000. So anything involving more than $2,000 had to go to the Supreme Court, and could only be done when a Supreme Court judge came to Corner Brook on circuit, which was a difficult situation because they'd come out for a week or 10 days, and you'd have to cram. I mean, there are times when I did 3 or 4 civil cases and maybe a criminal case in that circuit, and the other lawyers were the same. Everybody was in the same boat, but it was a very difficult way to practice law, and I kept trying to persuade people that they should have a sitting Supreme Court judge in Corner Brook, and I made that argument for a very long time, but it never happened until after I left Corner Brook, before there was a Supreme Court judge permanently in Corner Brook, which meant I ended up flying into St. John's Sunday night and then trying to get home on Friday evening, and often as not, fog prevented it, and I had to get in the car and drive. So it was challenge and very difficult on my wife, who was home and had sole responsibility for the children. So it was exceedingly challenging for her in particular.
Yes, yeah. Now, in 1966, Premier Smallwood approached you and asked you if you would run for the Liberals.
Yes.
Had you given any thought to entering politics prior to that?
No, not entering elected politics. I'd been involved politically ever since my days at Memorial, when I was a member of the University Liberal Club and active with them, and less so when I was at law school. I had little or no involvement with the Liberal Club there. When I came back to Corner Brook, I got involved again, was involved with the formation of the Young Liberal organization in about 1964, 65, and in fact was the first president of it. And so that's what would have caused Mr. Smallwood to do it, not any motion on my part. But he had tapped not only me, a number of others. You may recall, this was for the 66 election. It was in the summer of 66, and he'd then been in office 17 years. And his proposition was that I'm going to be retiring soon. And I wanted to bring in fresh new blood into the Liberal Party to take over and be able to continue on and so on. And this was the case he was going to make in the election. And he did. That was the basis on which he ran that election. So he had arranged Alec Hickman to be involved. Alec was appointed Minister of Justice before he was elected in August. John Crosby was appointed Minister of Municipal Affairs before he was elected. I was appointed Minister of Labor before I was elected, all in the middle of August in 1966, and a few days later he called the election. He had suggested at first that he wanted me to run in Humber West, where the minister he told me was retiring. Charlie Ballum was Minister of Labor. But I don't think he wanted to retire that quickly. He might have been persuaded to retire by Mr. Smallwood. In any event, he did, and I was sworn in as Minister of Labor. Then Mr. Smallwood had a quick change, and instead of my running in Humber West, he said, I'll run in Humber West, and you run against the leader of the opposition in Humber East, Dr. Noel Murphy. And I wasn't anxious. I was just getting my law practice established, and I wasn't anxious to get involved in politics at that time. I had agreed to do it and fill the spot for him, but I wasn't terribly excited about being elected and taken away from the law firm. So, nevertheless, I did, and lo and behold, I won the seat.
Yeah.
I don't suggest for a moment that it was any great merit that I brought to the campaign. I've no doubt that Mr. Smallwood was successful in winning 39 of the 42 seats in that election, which is an incredible feat after 17 years in office. And I've no doubt that most of us Liberals who won were brought in on his coattails, not because people thought that he was absolutely essential, but I think the people of Newfoundland had seen such improvement in their well-being and their prospects and their way of life over the first 17 years of Confederation, that when Mr. Smallwood said, I've done what I could, I'm getting out, I want to leave the Liberal Party in good shape, we've got all these new young blood coming in, I'm now ready to leave, and he essentially was asking people to express their appreciation, and they did in overwhelming numbers. And he won 39 of the 42 seats.
Eventually, you parted company with Mr. Smallwood over the financing of the Come By Chance oil refinery, yourself and John Crosby. you don't see very many people resigning on principle anymore, but you resigned on principle. Was that a difficult decision?
The difficult aspect of it was doing it, resigning, because you didn't want to be upsetting the political apple cart. But Mr. Smallwood had left us no choice. It wasn't our differences with Mr. Smallwood was not confined to that. We had been initially critical of the proposal to get the government involved in building a linerboard mill at Stephenville and having the government commit significant sums. And Mr. Smallwood, when Crosby and I opposed it, and there were other things that we were critical of. We were concerned about the level of debt in the province at the time. We were concerned about the proposal to implement provincial family allowance on top of the other. He'd been so successful with family allowance that in the '66 campaign he promised to add to that a provincial family allowance. And we thought that was a kind of madness beyond our ability. And we opposed it in cabinet, and that got Mr. Smallwood a bit bothered. And just before the election in 1966, the Pushy Commission brought in their report on the Royal Commission on the Economic State and Prospects of Newfoundland. And that did a tremendously detailed assessment of the financial state of the province, the challenges ahead, what the challenges would be, and what the economic prospects were, and what we needed to do to deal with it, and was rather critical of the government's financial and fiscal policies. Crosby and I tried our best to cause the government to take actions that were more consistent with the recommendations of this Royal Commission, and the result was we were often at odds, and it was only the two of us. We were at odds with the Premier and the rest of the cabinet. So the Come By Chance oil refinery was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. There were other concerns as well, and the initial one was the linerboard mill at Stephenville, and Mr. Smallwood took the position, well, look, if you fellows think you know so much and you're so good at it, you take responsibility to negotiate the matter on behalf of the government, and did the same with the Shaheen oil refinery at Come By Chance. So Crosby and I were assigned responsibility essentially to be the lawyers for the government. We had a Department of Justice lawyer with us, but we did the negotiation on behalf of the government. We didn't finish the linerboard mill negotiations, but the Come By Chance negotiations were coming to fruition fairly quickly. And we were not prepared to agree with some of what Mr. Shaheen wanted to do. And the particular clause that caused our resistance at the time was a proposal that the government would put up $5 million. Now you got to remember, $5 million was a huge sum for the government of Newfoundland at that time. It's not so much today in proportion to the overall budget, but that was a major portion of Newfoundland's budget at that time. We were to advance to the company interim financing of $5 million. And he wanted a clause in the contract that Shaheen Natural Resources would be reimbursed all of their promotional expenses plus 25% for all of their promotional expenses involved in proposing it. And it would have worked out to just about $5 million. So I knew where the $5 million was going to go, and we opposed it. There were other things that we disagreed with, and Mr. Shaheen would go behind our backs to Mr. Smallwood and complain, and he'd attempt to give us instructions, and we would be considerate of what he wanted to do, but there were certain things that we wouldn't agree with. And the straw that broke the camel's back was this interim financing of $5 million, because once the government put up that $5 million, you had no bargaining power left. It would have meant that Shaheen had nothing to lose because if he lost the whole thing, he would have had his money back with the $5 million, and the government would have had, so there would be no bargaining power left, and he could essentially demand whatever he wanted. So we wouldn't agree with it. Mr. Smallwood took quite strong positions at the time, and I remember him saying to us, "I warn you," he said, "if you fellows do this and stop this, I'll stop at nothing." And we still persisted, and then there were other meetings with Mr. Smallwood, and the Liberal leadership campaign when Trudeau was elected in April of '68. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to make sure that we wouldn't talk to any of the other cabinet ministers. He asked us not to, so we decided not to. Well, that was a mistake. The result is that when he came back and had a meeting with us, I flew in from Corner Brook in the morning and got in about 9 o'clock or so, and went into John's office. And just as I got in John's office, he was leaving. And he said, "The Premier called, he wants to see me." I said, "Okay, let's go." No, he said, "He wants to see me alone." And I said, "Really?" "Yes," he said. I said, "Now, John, you know about the principle of divide and conquer. Bear that in mind." And I said, "You can tell him that I'll be sitting in Mrs. Templeman's office outside the door to his, and I want to know what's happening." So I went up and I sat there. It seemed to me they weren't in there all that long, maybe 10, 15 minutes. And the door opened, the Premier came out, and he said, "Clyde, John will fill you in." I didn't know what had happened, so I said, "Okay." John came out, and he said, "The Premier's got a proposal for us." I said, "Is that right?" "Yes." "What is it?" "He will give us a letter saying the government has no intention of advancing the $5 million, and the government will not advance the $5 million to Shaheen, but they want it in the legislation and in the agreement to demonstrate to others in the oil industry and the bankers that the government is sincere about this." Mm-hmm. I said, "But the intention is not to do it." "That's right," he said. "And he'll give us a letter saying it won't be done." And I said, "What else?" He said, "Well, he's given me the opportunity to develop government policy arising out of the Royal Commission on Economic State and Prospects." And I said, "What did you say to that?" He said, "I told him that I would only consider it if you could work with me on it." And what did he say to that? He said, "Well, if that's the way you want it, John, you and Clyde can work together on this." So we talked about it, and John said, I think we should take it." And I said, you can't be serious. We can't do that." "Well, why not?" I said, "We'd be participating in a fraudulent representation that this is going to be done for the purpose of inducing others to have certain dealings with Mr. Shaheen when we know that's not going to be done. Or Smallwood's going to do it anyway, and we'll just be accused of some nefarious motive for trying to prevent it from happening." So I was a bit concerned. I spent most of the day talking to John about it, and then he had other things to do, and so did I. By that time, I had ceased to be a Minister of Labor because I couldn't do that and attend to my law practice at the same time, but I remained in Cabinet as a Minister with a portfolio, which is what Mr. Smallwood wanted. So I didn't have a departmental problem at that time, but John was then Minister of Health, and so he had to deal with those issues. But by the end of the day, John had made up his mind. He was going to accept Mr. Smallwood's offer. That left me alone. So I called Eleanor and told her, I said, "No, this is what's happened. And you got to be aware that Mr. Smallwood had told us that if we resigned over this, he would stop at nothing." And he reminded us that one other minister tried that one time and nobody heard anything from him for a long time. Years later, they heard he got a job up in Ontario somewhere. He wasn't very subtle about his position on things. But nevertheless, that was what was going to happen. So I went back to the hotel, and about 9 o'clock, the phone rang. It was John. He said, "Clyde, can you come down?" I said, "Yes," so I did. And there were three other people in the room besides John, an uncle of John's, a brother of John's, and Tom Ryan, who was a political advisor of John. And they'd been having a discussion about this development and John and I being divided, and I was going to resign and John wasn't, and what the impact of that might be on John and so on. And then I told John what Mr. Smallwood had said to me a couple of weeks earlier. He called me over, and I hadn't told John before. He called me over in the house and he said, "You notice our friend is quiet these days." I said, "I don't know what you mean." He said, "Our friend from St. John's West. You're not going to hear any more from him." I said, "John," I said, "well, why is that?" He said, "Well, I gave him what he wanted." I said, "Really?" "Yes," he said. "I assured him that his family would get all the insurance business arising out of the linerboard mill in Stephenville, and all of the shipping business arising out of the oil refinery at Come-by-Chance." And I said, "Really?" "Yes," he said. Now, I took this to be a divide and conquer by Mr. Smallwood, so I never told John about it, never until that night. And that night, I told him this. He said, "That's a dirty, rotten lie." "That's it," he said. "I'm resigning." So we switched again. And we did resign the next day. And sure enough, Mr. Smallwood gave him a letter demanding his resignation because he said he had demanded that his family companies have the insurance business and the shipping business. That was the complaint, the basis on which Mr. Smallwood said he demanded John's resignation. Now, I've never said that publicly anywhere before. You're hearing it for the first time. But I've told some other people.
We've talked about so much, I think we're going to have you back for part 2 of the interview. And you can join us again for that portion of the interview next week. In the meantime, thank you for watching Karl Wells Point to Point. See you next time.